Okay, practical applications. We talked a bit before about lighting design, and I'm just going to talk now. Brian's talked about lots of things you can do regarding saving energy with controls and stuff, but now talk a little bit about different applications that you're dealing with as property managers, and how there might be some ideas to how you can tailor your carbon reduced energy lighting scheme to be a good fit for what you're trying to do. So, lighting design, what do people think of lighting design as? Typically, lighting design is someone's got a plan and they drew light fittings on it, and they call that a lighting design. For a house, it's probably to make the house look nice, but in commercial applications, we're doing something slightly different. The first thing to think about is there is a lighting standard, and if we take our lighting design along to an engineering practice and say, can you do us a lighting design? They'll dig out the standard and give you a lighting design, giving you the relevant amount of light according to the standard. Now, the standards that are currently used in New Zealand are very old, as I said before, and I'm not saying that they're not relevant. But one thing to remember is the standard is classed as a minimum standard, so we should have more than a minimum. But if you work with the standard, and I'm actually on a couple of different lighting standards committees, you have to sort of think about also what the standard was intended to do when it was written, and how that's relevant now. The current lighting standard that we have for an office area was actually reviewed 20 years ago, hasn't been reviewed since. It's actually based on a standard that's 40 years old, and it's an old British standard. And so again, I don't want to be sort of poking a stick at anyone, but if you go back and look at the workplace standard, the activities that the current office standard was designed around were to facilitate the task of reading a carbon copied paper written with an HB pencil. And that was what the lighting standard was deemed to be, and they obviously got some people around and worked out how much light they needed so they could read this paperwork in an office 40, 50 years ago. When we think of our office today, they're quite different. Not many people are using carbon paper, not many people are using HB pencils, but what they are doing is looking at screens, looking at reports, doing a whole lot of different functions. So where back then we had a whole lot of people, maybe in some of those old office situations, there was even hundreds of people sitting there reading dockets or doing things, doing quite manual processing type work. That's not what we do in an office anymore. And so we have to think of our environment a bit different and think of our lightings different. And regardless of whether you're building a new building or doing a retrofit type situation, you now have the capabilities of perhaps changing your environment a bit to make it more suitable for the modern environment and modern tasks. And when you're doing that, I think you have to think about who are you going to get some advice from. It's great if you can learn a lot yourself, but also perhaps the typical person to go to get a lighting calculation done may be an engineer, but maybe you should also involve your architect or a true lighting designer, or someone else who's involved in your workplace safety and comfort. We will be driven by numbers, by engineers, and we are driven by numbers when we're talking about carbon accounting. But also just make sure that you are having a really cool, why not take this opportunity to make it a better environment to increase the overall performance of your workspace. We're going to look now at a few different basic lighting applications and just talk about a few different things. And then I think the other guys are going to talk about the numbers. But we're going to look at a few different things and also some of the shortcomings and difficulties we have with lighting in New Zealand. I chucked up a picture here of what I consider to be a good office lighting space. But what are we looking at doing? Basically, we want to make sure we've got adequate light in a space, and this is an office. Should be comfortable to work in. Should have relevant amount to glare. Now, glare is something that everyone talks about. Oh, the glare's got to be right. But glare has changed also in what's happening in an office space. Back in the old office space, you were sitting in probably a pretty big office, and glare was from the light fittings or from the sun coming in the window. But the sun coming in the window back in the olden days was actually most of the lighting, because there wasn't much coming out of the light fittings. So if you think about those old buildings that were built in the 1920s and 30s, a lot of the office spaces had very, very tall ceiling heights, very, very large windows to let in the maximum amount of light. We don't do that anymore. Now we have little wee windows, maybe only along one side. We've also changed what we're doing in terms of we're no longer looking across the room, seeing the light fittings on our horizon. We're now looking at a screen, and the glare could be coming from the window. So glare from light fittings are important, but glare must be considered in lots of ways. It's glare from light fittings, it's also glare from natural light sources. Again, in this one, you'll see this is an office space. They've got a single light fitting here hanging over a workstation for 4 people. It's quite different to what we typically do in New Zealand, where we'd put the lights in the ceiling. But it's a single light fitting, the lights going up and going down, providing a nice luminous lit environment. And they've eliminated or reduced the possibility of glare in the windows. They've got some nice louvers outside their windows. I don't know if they're moving ones or fixed ones, but they've also have addressed the glare issue outside. So typical office, nice environment, nothing too fancy, but very, very suitable for making the people comfortable and able to do their work. That's an office. The next one we're putting up there is a factory, and pretty obvious looking at this, a commercial application. It looks like it's probably a Chinese factory. And I think why I put this one up here is we talk about manufacturing, and we talk about, how Chinese factories or perhaps some of these other factories are very, very productive compared to what we would achieve in New Zealand. They get higher outputs from their people, higher outputs from their factory. But in this picture, look how many lights they've got. They've lit that place to heck. These people are working hard, they can see what they're doing, they're getting on with the job. Whether you agree with this type of labour or not is a different thing, but the point was made, we don't light factories like that in New Zealand. We just don't put that much light into it. But they've obviously seen the benefit in doing that to make sure that the people are comfortable in what they're doing. Again, in this case, most of these people are looking down. The light is on the workspace in front of them, and they can all see what they're doing with minimum shadows, and they're very happy in doing what they're doing. The next one is a commercial application. And again, this is pretty typical, but I just put this one up to highlight the difference. Again, it's a different thing here. Our standards, again, talk about lighting on the floor. Why we really talk about lighting on the floor in a warehouse is a little strange. Perhaps it used to be because a man walked around with a clipboard. But nowadays, really the most important thing about a warehouse is safety. We've got moving machinery and those sort of things in there. And if we are looking at anything, we're probably looking at the vertical illumination on the sides of whether it's on the sides of the cartons or the sides of the pallets or whatever. We need high levels of light on this level, not so much on the floor. We need to be safe in moving around. And this is another area where we can talk about controls, and I'll talk about that later, but whether we need all the lights on all of the time. This room doesn't have daylight in it. Again, in New Zealand, we tend to put skylights in warehouses, and they may or may not be useful for lighting in a commercial environment. Our next environment is, I put up a picture of a hospital, but really I put this up because just to highlight what's going on in a multitasking environment. They say this is a hospital, but it could be a meeting room, it could be a meet and greet type space, or a boardroom. But what we've got here is, just to highlight, we've got lots of different light fittings. We've got light fittings in the ceiling, which are obviously for general lighting. And again, in this sort of space, your general lighting is probably going to be at a reasonably high level because of what's going on. There's people moving around, there's things going on. But later in the evening, I'm sure they'll turn these lights off and use the bedhead light just to provide some safety and comfort for the person in the bed. And then also you'll see, if you can see just here, there's a couple of inspection type lights for where if this isn't obviously a surgery area, but there's some inspection type lights if dressings need changing, that sort of thing. They can increase the lighting level to the local area to change the lighting for the task at hand. So we've got multitasking here, and we talk about using layers of light to provide flexibility in a workspace. And of course, the opportunity here is when the lights aren't needed, they can be turned off, and whether that's automatic or manual, again, you can save your energy, save your carbon by reducing the light when it's not required. But we were talking before about lighting design, and I came across this picture, so I'd put it up as well. Again, it's a hospital just to show how lighting can both be good, but also provide comfort in a different way. This is a hospital corridor, and you think it's all a bit strange because they've got this line of light that's down the edge of the corridor. You think, well, that's a bit strange. Why did you do that? Normally you just put some lights down the middle. But again, you think about what's going on in this space. Well, hopefully not a lot, because hopefully the patients have all got rooms to go to. But in this case, what are we doing most of the time in corridors? We're pushing people down the corridor laying on their back on a bed who are looking up at the ceiling. Most of these people have just been injured or unwell and they don't want to be distressed. Pushing them down a corridor, looking up, seeing lights go flick, 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 flick is exactly the thing we don't want to be. We're introducing poor uniformity, all those things, high levels of glare, all these things we didn't want to do. Good lighting design, continuous line of light along one side of the corridor, so when the person's laying on the bed looking up, they're just seeing a nice illuminated ceiling, very comfortable to be transitioned around the hospital. No more energy used, no more carbon used, but we've got a much better lighting design. And my last comment on lighting design was about sports grounds or outdoor activities. LEDs, as we've seen before from some of Brian's slides, are very new, but nowadays, and originally we couldn't do everything with LED. The high-powered LEDs just weren't available. Nowadays you can do anything with LED. The power is there. It's possible to light when Wembley's lit with LEDs. We'll see sports grounds in New Zealand being lit with LEDs in New Zealand more and more in the near future, I'm sure. But the other thing to remember though is we think about, because it's in the middle of the night and there's a very, very well lit sports ground, that this is where our energy is being used. Quite often that actually the lighting of the sports ground is a less energy use than the lighting of the nearby facilities. So when we're thinking about, councils will be going, I've got to relight all my sports grounds, but don't only think about to reduce energy, reduce carbon. Don't only think about your sports grounds. It's the car parks. If you've got a Eden Park or whatever, or a stadium, it's the stadium lighting. The back of house and all those areas can often be a greater energy use than the actual sports lighting. And actually there's many more greater savings to be made with the associated lighting with sports and event centres. So back to today, and many of you won't be talking about new builds though. You'll be talking about looking at retrofits and upgrades. So I thought I'd just go through those applications again and talk about what sort of things you should look for and what sort of savings can be achieved. And then after, some of these other guys are going to talk about putting numbers to it. My first one there again is this, I'm going to talk briefly about offices and say just there's many ways of doing things, and if you do have the capability of doing a major change, you should look at doing things differently. In most cases when we're doing a retrofit, you're going to be looking at sort of changing one light for light, but this was just to talk about why lighting is a little bit strange in New Zealand. Lights are part of the commercial building. If we're leasing buildings, they're usually the landlord's property. This is different to other parts in the world. If you look in Europe, if you go to lease a commercial space, often when you lease a commercial space, it won't have a ceiling, it won't have a floor covering. It's up to the tenant to fit all that out. That means that the choice of lighting becomes that choice of the tenant. And again, obviously he has to think that about how he's going to build that into his cost of tenancy, but also it gives him flexibility to do what he wants. He also means if he wants to invest more for better lighting, that's up to him. In New Zealand, where we go to lease a commercial space, even a brand new space, unless we were involved in the building and the design of the building or early on in the design of the building, you probably find the lights already installed by the landlord, and you're sort of stuck with them. So it's a difficult one. You can't overcome it, because I think Brian's going to talk later about other things such as the opportunity to have, rather than just buying your own lights and operating, having lights as a service. That only really works if you own your own building. I put this picture up just to show you in a European picture. This is the building, obviously, where the tenant decided that he'd lease his building. They didn't want to put lights in the ceiling, so they've rather than putting them into the ceiling, they've got suspended and freestanding lighting. Different concept to what's mainly used in New Zealand. But in this case, these lights are owned by the tenant rather than the landlord, and they can utilise their money to invest to provide the best economic and lighting output for themselves. And in these cases, many of the commercial situations in this type of property, the owner would take the light fittings with them when they left, whereas we tend to leave the building behind and leave the light fittings behind for the next person. But unless you're going to break the mold in New Zealand, we're probably back to looking at lights in the ceiling in a commercial space. So typical building in New Zealand, probably if you're in an office space or a commercial space, we're going to talk about replacing fluorescent for LED. It's probably a fluorescent sitting that's in there. So what will we look for? Or what's going to happen if we go and replace our light fittings, our fluorescent light fittings for LED? You're actually probably going to get more light to start with. That's just going to happen. And the reason that's going to happen is probably your fluorescent scheme hasn't been maintained very well. When it was first installed 10, 20, 30 years ago, it was probably very good. Replacing it with new LEDs is going to give you more light. That's good. We need to think about things like glare. And again, basically, you've got to think about the fittings that are chosen have to be suitable for the environment you're putting them in. Basically, fittings that don't control glare will cost you less than fittings that do control glare. It's going to, so if you have to go cheap, you're not going to get as good as what you get. And again, that's something you need to consider. Not only in like if you're choosing the light fitting, but in the way you go about procuring things. If you just go out to tender lights, unless you're very, very clear of your scope and those sort of things, you will get a cheap price, you'll end up with a cheap product. All light fitting companies make different grades of products, so you're not necessarily saying, oh, I got a cheap light from here or whatever. You've got to make sure that you're buying what you want. One comment I will make about a ceiling, and this is most of our suspended ceilings in New Zealand have a 1200 by 600 grid. We're in a room here which actually has an unusual grid. It's 1200 by 450 by the look of it, which is quite an unusual light fitting. But most of the big old fluorescent light fittings will be a full ceiling tile, so they're bigger than these ceiling tiles, a great big one. If you're going to do a complete one-to-one change, you can choose a fitting that's the same size as that, because that's going to be easiest. Take out the old fitting, put in a new fitting. If you're doing a big retrofit or a big rewrite and you're changing the ceiling, think about changing your ceiling tiles and using a smaller light fitting. We needed a big light fitting, 1200 by 600, with 3 or 4 fluorescent tubes in it to get all the light out, to have enough light to light our office. We don't need a light fitting that big anymore to provide that amount of light. If you cut up your ceiling tile to either this way to make it 1200 by 300, or cut across to 600 square light fittings, they will cost you a lot less. When you're buying a light fitting, you're buying materials. You're buying all this metal, all this diffuser material, all these LEDs to light up this big space. If you can change your ceiling, go for a smaller light fitting. You can get enough light, and your light fittings almost cost half as much because they're physically half as much light fitting that you're buying. In an office lighting space, when you're talking about changing from fluorescent to LED, you should get, rule of thumb, you should get a 50% energy saving just by doing it. That's with no controls, so operating them exactly the same as what you're doing now, you'll get a 50% reduction in light. If you start talking about smart controls, whether that's dimming or even just making sure they're turning on and off more accurately, which is much easier to do, you can of course increase more energy savings. And it's quite possible in a lot of situations that you can get a 50% energy saving based on just changing your technology, and then you can get another 50% by the use of not too invasive controls. So you can actually get a 75% energy saving in a workspace, which is significant. And I think it takes our energy bill from a significant bill to an almost insignificant bill. That's an office. If we look at a commercial environment, you're not talking about fluorescent, probably. You're probably talking about replacing an HID lamp that Brian showed you before, some sort of high bay type fitting with LED. Again, you'll probably get more light when you put up your LED fittings. Again, you have to think about what you're doing. Glare is very important in a warehouse, probably more important in a warehouse. Sorry? To speed it up, yeah, sorry, more important than it was before, because again, we're changing what we're doing in a warehouse. It used to be we were walking around and physically, now we're using a lot of machinery. A lot of that machinery is elevated, looking up at shelves and those sort of things. Vertical lighting is very important, as I said before, in a warehouse. But again, typically you should be getting 50% energy savings just by changing your lighting system in a commercial environment. I put up a picture of a flash house just to show if you like, a multi-space environment. And I think there's some people here from Kaingaora that talking about residential. It's a little bit different in a residential situation or a thing, because we're changing probably from incandescent or maybe halogen to LED. And here we're not talking about a 50% energy reduction, we're talking about up to 80 or 90 or even 95% energy reduction. So again, your bill goes from being quite significant to almost nothing at all. In a residential situation, the secret, and it's difficult to do if they're not owner-tenanted properties, but having more switching, more controls is a really good thing, because again, it's about using energy and using light where you need it and not using it where you don't. Brian spoke briefly about the idea of just changing the lamps. That again is a tricky thing. Just changing the lamps does provide the savings today, although nowhere near, you're probably only going to pick up half the energy saving that you would if you changed the fitting. And the other thing is, of course, it's not locking it in. So if you change all your lamps to an LED lamp, it's a marvellous thing. We've perhaps saved half our power. We could have saved 80 or 90%. We've saved half our power. But what happens when that LED lamp fails? Do we go down the supermarket and buy another LED lamp for $20, or do we resort back to buying an incandescent lamp for $2, which again undoes that savings? That's a difficult one. And my last slide on applications was just a project here, and I wanted to show this project because this is a new project. It's in New Zealand. It's the new Scion building in Rotorua. It's a government agency, forestry research building. And this slide just highlighted what good lighting can do. Huge amount of daylight in here, so they don't need the lights on all the time. Obviously, one of the tasks here is to walk up the stairs. They've got this lovely line of light going up the stairs, illuminating the stairs. Over the side here, there's their cafe breakout area. A little bit hard to see in this photo, but there's some hanging down lights here just to provide the right amount of light in this area. It's a 6-star Green Star building. It's a brand new building, but they've really taken it on board to do the lighting properly, to have minimal energy use, and also provide a stunning environment. So it's all possible to do it, and it didn't cost any more than just doing a typical ordinary business as usual type of lighting design. So my brief overview on different things to think about lighting is that's it. So I'm handing over now to Brian to talk about reporting of energy and carbon outcomes.